The gate to Caldwick Hall stood open in the November dusk, just as it always had, and Cecily Vane stood before it like a woman who had forgotten whether she was permitted to enter her own house. 14 months. The number had a weight now that arithmetic alone could not account for. She had carried it across the Bay of Biscay on a plank and half a prayer. She had carried it through 3 months in a Portuguese convent where the sisters called her a miracle in a language she barely understood and fed her broth until she could stand unaided. She had carried it through roads churned to mud by retreating armies, through a coach from Santander, through a packet from Bilbao that smelled of salt fish and wet rope, and now she carried it here, to this gate, to this gravel drive, to the tall windows of Caldwick Hall spilling warm light into the failing afternoon. She was gaunt. She knew it. Her traveling gown had been let out twice, and then taken in, and still did not sit right at the shoulder. Her hands, gripping the iron gate, were chapped from wind and from weeks of work she had never done before. She had been the Countess of Caldwick when she sailed. She did not yet know what she was now. What she knew was this. She had survived on the fisherman's boat for 2 days while they made for a coastal port, wrapped in a canvas sail that smelled of brine and old work, too cold to think clearly, thinking very clearly. She had survived the convent's first month of fever, tended by a sister who spoke no English, and communicated by gesture and by the quality of her attention at the bedside, which was its own eloquence. She had survived the slow restoration of her body to something resembling function, and the slow restoration of her mind to something resembling purpose, and the long months on the road with documents she had obtained through the convent's connection to a British consul, traveling by stages in the company of other people's journeys, because she had no other way home. She had not been sad, exactly, in those months. She had been concentrated. There is a form of surviving that requires all available attention and leaves nothing over for grief, and she had been in that form since the morning the sea came through the ship's side, and it had served her, and she was grateful for it, and she understood that the grief would wait until she was somewhere it was safe to feel it. She had not yet been somewhere it was safe to feel it. A young footman appeared on the front step. He was new. She did not know his face, and he plainly did not know hers. He looked at her as one looks at a beggar who has wandered to the wrong address. Then he looked again, more carefully, and she watched the color leave him. He turned and disappeared inside without a word to her, and she heard him, quite distinctly, say to someone in the hall. She heard him address the housekeeper, his voice pitched low. Mrs. Pelham. There is a ghost at the gate. Cecily did not move. She stood in the cold and watched the long dining-room window, and in its amber light she saw the shape of a woman she did not recognize, seated at the table that had been her table, in the chair that had been her chair, her dark head bent over what appeared to be a letter or an account book. Entirely at her ease, the body knows things before the mind will permit them. Cecily's hands released the gate. She stepped onto the gravel drive. She walked toward her own front door. The gravel was the same gravel. She had chosen it herself. In the second year of the marriage, the pale Suffolk flint that caught the light in a particular way at midday. She had not expected to notice the gravel. She noticed everything. The iron boot scraper at the step. The lantern above the door, burning already in the early dark. The long smell of box hedge and cold earth that was particular to this entrance, to this season, to this place. Her body knew it before her mind had caught up. Mrs. Pelham appeared in the doorway behind the footman. She was a small, steady woman of 50, and she had served this house for 23 years. and she looked at Cecily in the lamplight with an expression that went through several stages very quickly, none of which Cecily could have named with confidence. And then she said, "My lady," in a voice that held everything it could not say, and stepped aside so Cecily could enter her own house. If you have stayed with a story that begins like this one, you already know it will not end in that driveway. Stay a little longer. She had sailed in September of 1814, the last warmth of the season still in the London air, her trunks loaded the evening before with more care than speed, because she had not wanted to go. She had told Edmund as much. They had argued about it, which was not uncommon in the 4th year of a marriage. And then they had not spoken about it, which was worse. Her mother was dying in Lisbon. Edmund had engagements at the estate that could not wait 3 weeks. He would follow by the end of the month, he said. He said it with his back to the window, and she had accepted it. And they had parted without the warmth she had wanted. And she had boarded the packet at Falmouth with a kind of hollow resignation. She told herself she would address when she returned. The Santa Beatrice went down in a storm off the Portuguese coast on the 14th of September. She was at morning prayer with 2 other passengers when the sea came through the side of the ship as though the planking were paper. She remembered cold. She remembered a rope. She remembered the face of a Portuguese fisherman, baffled and kind, who hauled her over the side of his vessel, like something he had not expected to catch. She did not remember much else for some time after that. Edmund received word in October. She had read the letter he sent later, when it was retrieved from the convent's small collection of foreign correspondence that had arrived in her name and never been collected. He had written it in the first 2 days after the wreck, before any survivor's manifest had been consulted. He had written these words, in the hand she knew better than her own. "I cannot account for what I am to do without you. I did not say what I meant to say. I did not come when I should have come. I am writing to you as though you can still read this, because I cannot write to anyone else." She had read that letter in a convent garden in March, 7 months after he wrote it, 5 months after the estate's solicitor had processed the formal declaration of her death at Lady Agatha's insistence, 4 months after the arrangements at Caldwick Hall had begun to change. She had held the letter, and then she had folded it and placed it in her pocket next to the small silver mirror Edmund had given her on their wedding morning, the one with a rose etched on the back, the one she had slipped into her traveling case as a matter of habit, the one that had been in her pocket when she went into the sea and had come up with her when the fisherman pulled her out. Some things survive. She had not known, when she packed it, that it would be the object she pressed to her mouth in the dark of a Portuguese winter to keep from making a sound. She arrived at Caldwick Hall on the 10th of November. Mrs. Pelham, the housekeeper who had known her since the week she arrived as a new bride, came to the entrance hall with a lamp and a face as white as the plasterwork overhead. She said, simply, "My lady," and then pressed both hands to her mouth, and neither of them spoke for a moment. And then Mrs. Pelham said, "His lordship is in the library," and then said, "Miss Liesel is in the dining room," and then said very quietly, "Forgive us, my lady. Forgive the house." Cecily looked at the hall she had ordered repainted in the 1st year of her marriage. She looked at the arrangement of dried flowers on the side table, which was not the arrangement she would have chosen. She looked at her own reflection in the large gilt mirror above the fireplace and barely recognized herself. She said, "Fetch his lordship, and please do not ask Miss Liesel to leave the dining room on my account. She is at her supper." Edmund came to the hall doorway and stopped. He was thinner than she remembered. There were lines at his eyes that had not been there when she sailed. He was in his evening coat, clearly interrupted in the middle of whatever the evening had held, and he stood in the doorway of the library and looked at her across the entrance hall, with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not shock, not relief. Something prior to both of those things. Something rawer and less defensible. The look of a man who had not yet decided whether what he was seeing was real. She did not move. She let him look. He crossed the hall to her. He stopped 4 feet from her and looked at her face, and then at her hands, and then at her face again. And then he reached out and placed the tips of his fingers very lightly against her jaw, as if testing the temperature of a thing he did not trust. And then he withdrew his hand and said very quietly, "Cecily." She said, "Edmund." He said, "You are alive." She said, "I have been alive the entire time." It was not a kind thing to say. She had not intended kindness. The dining room was 20 feet away, and the door was open, and neither of them was in a position to afford a scene, and so they did not have one. He led her to the library, and Mrs. Pelham brought tea that neither of them touched, and he told her what had happened in the 14 months she had been away, and she listened with her hands folded in her lap and her back very straight. And when he had finished, she reached into her pocket and placed the small silver mirror on the table between them. He looked at it. He did not touch it. "I carried it in," she said. "I carried it out." He did not speak for a long moment. Then he said, "Where will you sleep tonight?" It was the wrong question, and she could see that he knew it was the wrong question the moment he said it. She looked at him with a steadiness that had cost her 3 months in a convent bed to acquire, and she said, "In my house, Edmund. I will sleep in my house." She was given the east room. It was a comfortable room. It was not her room. Her room had been on the west side of the house, overlooking the kitchen garden, and it had been her room for 4 years. It was Dorothea Lysel's room now. Cecily had seen the candlelight under the door as she passed in the corridor, and she had not paused, and she had not knocked, and she had gone to the east room and closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed for a very long time without undressing. She had expected to feel rage. She found something more complicated waiting for her instead. The house smelled like home. The linen on the bed was the linen she had ordered from the London merchant 3 winters ago. The fire was lit, and whoever had lit it had done it in the way she had always preferred, banking the coals so they would last through the night. This was still in some register that the law had temporarily failed to acknowledge. Her house. She was in it like a visitor. And a visitor in her own house was a species of loss she had not had language for until tonight. She did not sleep. At some point in the small hours she heard the quiet sound of a footstep in the corridor that stopped outside her door and did not enter. She knew the sound of his step. She had known it for 4 years. She lay still and listened to him stand outside her door for what must have been 10 minutes. And then the step retreated, and the house was quiet again. She rose before dawn. She could not do otherwise. The east room faced away from the garden, and she needed the garden. She had needed it since she arrived. The kitchen garden at Caldwick Hall was enclosed by a low stone wall with a wooden gate, and she had planted the herb bed in the first spring of her marriage, laying in rosemary and thyme and lavender, and a small bay tree she had brought from her father's house in a pot, because she had learned from her mother that a garden was the one thing a woman could put her hands into and call her own without anyone finding it unusual. In the month she had been gone, the bed had been tended, but only approximately, the way something is tended by someone who does not quite know what they are doing. The lavender had not been cut back. The rosemary had overgrown its border on one side. She knelt in the cold morning earth and began to work. She did not hear him come to the library window. She did not know he was there until much later, when he told her. And by then, it no longer mattered in the way she had imagined it might. He had been unable to sleep. He had come to the library at dawn to sit with his guilt in the room where he had received the first report of the wreck, which was a form of penance he had been practicing since October of the previous year. He had looked out the window at the gray November light and seen a figure in the kitchen garden kneeling at the herb bed. And it had taken him a moment to understand what he was seeing. Because Cecily had been dead for 14 months, and the body does not immediately release its architecture of grief. He stood at the window and watched her work. He watched her clear the overgrowth from the rosemary border and trim the dead lavender spikes with the small knife she had apparently found in the garden shed and brought with her. He watched her settle back on her heels and press her palms flat to the earth for a moment, with her head bowed, in the attitude of a woman who has just finished a thing that needed finishing. He watched her for a long time. He did not go down. He would tell her this later, in the library, by the fire. He told her that what he had felt watching her in the garden was not relief, though relief was somewhere in it, and not guilt, though guilt was the floor of everything, and not love exactly, though that word came closest. He told her it was a recognition, the belated recognition of something he had possessed and failed to see with any accuracy until it was gone. He told her that the specific image of her in the garden, her chapped hands in the earth of her own herb bed, had broken something open in him that the 14 months of formal grief had not. Because grief with its architecture of letters and solicitors and careful arrangements had been a way of controlling a loss he could not otherwise manage. The woman in the garden did not permit management. She was simply there, working, in the cold, because the herb bed needed it. He did not know how to go down. That was the truth of it. Dorothea Liesel came to Cecily's east room the following morning, and she came alone, without Lady Agatha's instruction, which Cecily noted. She was a handsome woman, Miss Liesel, with an honest face, and the composed manner of someone who has navigated a considerable amount of uncertainty without losing her footing entirely. She stood in the doorway and said, without preamble, "I was told you were dead, Lady Caldwick. I want you to know that is the only condition under which I would have come to this house." Cecily looked at her. "I do not doubt it," she said. "I should like to remove to the village inn today," Dorothea said. "I have spoken to Mrs. Pelham about my trunks." "You may stay as long as you need to arrange your affairs," Cecily said. "The inn is cold in November." Dorothea looked at her for a moment with something that was not quite pity and not quite admiration, and then she said quietly, "You are not what I imagined." And Cecily said, "I am not what I imagined either." And that was the whole of it between them. And it was enough. Lady Agatha arrived on the third day in a carriage that crunched over the gravel with the measured authority of long practice. She came into the hall and looked at Cecily, standing at the foot of the staircase with the composure of a woman who had been managing difficult situations in this house since before Edmund's father died, and she said, with a smile that did not reach quite as far as her eyes, "My dear, we are very glad you are returned to us." Cecily looked at her mother-in-law for a moment before she answered. She had liked Agatha once. She had never been entirely comfortable in her company, but she had liked her. She had understood, even in the early days of the marriage, that Agatha was not unkind, so much as certain, and certainty in a person is not the same thing as cruelty, even when it produces the same results. "Thank you, Lady Agatha," she said. "You must rest," Agatha said. "You must eat. You look terrible." "I have been at sea," Cecily said, "and on the road, and in a convent." "Yes," Agatha said, as if this were a minor inconvenience rather than 14 months of survival. Well, we shall put you right. She moved toward the drawing room. Edmund, she said without turning, come and sit with your mother. The drawing room conversation was managed, as Lady Agatha's conversations always were, with the precision of a general moving forces before engagement. She spoke of the estate. She spoke of the legal situation, which she characterized as complex, and of the declaration of death, which she characterized as unavoidable, and of the necessity of proceeding carefully so that Edmund's standing was not compromised. She spoke of the season's arrangements, and the arrangements for the house, and the arrangements for the succession. And throughout all of it, she did not look directly at Cecily, which was itself a form of looking. Then she said it to Edmund, not to Cecily, as if Cecily were already furniture in a room she no longer commanded. We mourned the ghost of a marriage, Edmund. You must think of the living now. Cecily felt the sentence land. She kept her hand still in her lap. Edmund said very quietly, I am sitting with my wife. Mother. Agatha paused. Legally, she said, and left the word alone in the room. Cecily let the evening pass. She had not survived the Bay of Biscay by fighting the wrong battles at the wrong moment. The guests at Caldwick Hall multiplied in the days that followed. Lady Agatha had arranged a supper party for local families before Cecily's return, and she did not cancel it, which was itself a statement. Cecily was not present at the supper. She ate in the East Room at Mrs. Pelham's gentle suggestion and her own quiet agreement, because the East Room was where she could think clearly, and she needed to think clearly. She had the silver mirror on the table beside her supper tray, and she turned it in her hands and listened to the sound of company below. Mrs. Pelham came to her room at 9 o'clock with a report, delivered in the housekeeper's careful, neutral voice. The party is very merry, my lady. Mr. Caversham from Brentford was asking after the East Wing. He said the local talk was, as he put it, rather colorful. He had said, in the drawing room, that they say there is a ghost walking the East Wing. The first wife, he called you. Back from the sea. Cecily set down the mirror. Thank you, Mrs. Pelham. My lady. She hesitated at the door. Good night, Mrs. Pelham, Cecily said. She sat with the mirror a long time after the housekeeper had gone. The first wife. Back from the sea. She turned it over and looked at the rose etched on the back, and thought about the morning Edmund had pressed it into her hands, the day they were married, in this house, in the chapel off the east corridor, with the spring light coming through the high windows. She had been 22. He had been 30. He had placed the mirror in her palm and closed her fingers around it and said nothing, which was very like him. And she had understood at the time that the saying nothing was the gift. She thought about the letter he had written. I did not say what I meant to say. I did not come when I should have come. She thought about going, about packing the single trunk she had arrived with, about walking down the stairs before dawn and through the kitchen garden, out the gate, down the lane, away. The thought lasted a full minute. It was a serious thought. She held the mirror and turned it over and thought about it with the same careful attention she had given every decision since September of the year before. She could leave. There was a decent inn in the village. She had a small amount of money from the consul's office, not much but enough for a week. She could write to her father's solicitor in London, who was still alive and would remember her, and she could begin the legal proceedings from there, from a neutral distance, without the indignity of sleeping in the East Room while her husband stood outside her door at 2 a.m. and then went away without speaking. That was the shape of one future. She turned the mirror over again and looked at the rose etched on the back. She had been in a Portuguese convent looking at this rose while the sisters sang the offices in the dark. She had been in a coach from Santander with this mirror in her lap. She had been on a packet from Bilbao holding it inside her cloak against the cold spray. She had not carried it through all of that in order to leave it behind on a dressing table in the east room of Caldwick Hall because the first week was difficult. She had not survived by being afraid of difficult things. The thought lasted a full minute. It was a serious thought. Then she set the mirror down on the table and blew out the candle and lay in the east room's darkness and waited for morning. The solicitor arrived on the 7th day. He came in Lady Agatha's carriage, which was information in itself, and he was shown into the library. And then Edmund sent for Cecily. And they stood together before Mr. Hawthorne of Hawthorne and Reeves in a room that smelled of old leather and cold ash, and Mr. Hawthorne explained, in the manner of a man who is genuinely sorry for a thing he has been instructed to do, that the legal declaration of Lady Caldwick's death had been processed in the court at the beginning of the year, and that her restoration to legal standing as Countess of Caldwick would require a formal proceeding, and that in the interim her position in the household was, he was sorry to say, uncertain. Lady Agatha stood by the library door, her hands folded, her expression one of careful concern. She said, "You understand, Cecily, that this is not a reflection on anyone's welcome here. It is simply the law." Cecily looked at Edmund. Edmund looked at the papers in Mr. Hawthorne's hands. She thought it plainly, without performance. Here is the moment. She had waited 7 days, and here was what the waiting was for. She had been in the sea and on the road and in a foreign convent, and she had carried a mirror in her pocket for 4 years, and if he did not look up from those papers in the next 10 seconds, she would know everything she needed to know. He looked up. He set the papers on the desk. He said, "Mr. Hawthorne, I appreciate your journey from London." He came around the desk. He walked past Mr. Hawthorne and past Lady Agatha and across the entrance hall to where Cecily stood near the great hall's outer door, her hand on the frame, because some part of her had already been preparing to leave, and she had not fully decided yet to stop. He stood in front of her and said nothing for a moment. His jaw was very still. His eyes were the color of smoke in a cold room. Then he turned to face the assembled household. Mrs. Pelham was in the corridor. 2 footmen had stopped in the passageway. Mr. Hawthorne stood in the library doorway. Lady Agatha had her hand at her throat, and through the drawing-room arch, Miss Liesel, who had not yet removed to the village, stood quietly with her hands clasped, watching. Edmund said, in a voice that required no elevation to carry, "She is my wife. She has always been my wife." The hall was very quiet. He took Cecily's hand. He did not face her. He faced the room. He held her hand at his side, the way you hold something you have nearly lost, with the specific care of someone who now knows exactly what careless holding costs. Lady Agatha's breath came out slowly through her nose. She unclenched her hand from her throat. She looked at her son for a long moment, and then she looked at Cecily. And Cecily saw, in the careful arrangement of Agatha's expression, the slow recognition of a woman whose script had run to its final page. She was not cruel. She had never been cruel. She had been certain, and the certainty had run out. "Edmund," Agatha said, and then stopped, and then did not say whatever she had prepared to say. Miss Liesel, in the drawing-room arch, gave a slight, deliberate nod. It was the nod of a person releasing something they had held with great care, precisely because they understood it was never entirely theirs. Mr. Hawthorne said, "I see," and began to fold the papers back into their case. He said to the middle distance, "I shall write to the court by the end of the week, my lord. In the circumstances, I expect the restoration of standing to be uncomplicated. Edmund said, "Thank you, Hawthorne." Cecily stood in the entrance hall of Caldwick House and felt the thing she had not permitted herself to feel since she had stood at the gate 9 days ago. It was the specific bodily relief of a place that is yours, returning to you. Not as conquest, but as recognition. Not triumph. Something quieter than triumph. Something that did not require anyone else's defeat. She had not come home to win. She had come home because this was home. She said quietly to Edmund, "I should like my rooms back." He said, "Yes," she said, "and I should like to sit by the library fire this evening." He said, "Yes," she said, "and I should like you to tell me what you did not say the morning I sailed." He did not answer immediately. His hand had not released hers. She felt the slight tightening of his fingers and understood it for what it was. "Not tonight," he said. "Not in the hall." She said, "No, not in the hall." The rooms were restored by evening. Mrs. Pelam managed it with the efficiency of a woman who had been waiting a considerable time for permission to do exactly this, and when Cecily stood in her own doorway and saw her own things in their places, and the window overlooking the kitchen garden and the bay tree in its pot on the sill, the one she had brought from her father's house, still alive, apparently tended by someone who had known it mattered, she put her hand on the doorframe and stood there for a moment, and breathed. Edmund came to the doorway at 10 o'clock. Not in the small hours. Not uncertain on the other side of a closed door. At 10 o'clock, in the firelight, and this time he came in. He sat in the chair by the hearth, and she sat across from him, and he told her. He told her about the morning he stood on the dock at Falmouth and watched her packet sail, and understood that he was standing there out of pride rather than necessity, that the estate engagements had been real, but could have been delegated, that he had chosen the argument over the voyage, because the argument felt safer than the admission that he could not bear to watch her grieve her mother. He told her about the month of waiting and the report, and the weeks after the report. He told her about the letter he had written to her, understanding she was dead, because he could not write to anyone else. He told her about October and November, and the long winter, and the legal papers and his mother's careful management of grief into arrangement. And he told her all of it in the level voice he used for things that cost him considerably. The voice she had learned in 4 years of marriage. The one that sounded like flatness and was actually the surface of something he did not have another register for. She listened. She did not interrupt. She had learned, somewhere in the months between the sea and this room, that some men's apologies require the courtesy of silence, the way a wound requires bandaging. That you do not speak over them, but simply hold still while they make their way through. When he had finished, she reached into her pocket and drew out the silver mirror and set it on the small table between them. "You gave me that," she said, "on the morning we were married." He looked at it. He reached out and picked it up and turned it in his hands. And she watched him look at the rose on the back. "I carried it into the sea," she said. "I carried it out." She felt the warmth in her face, and the quickening of something she had kept very still for the past 9 days, because she had needed to keep it still, because she had not known until this evening whether this was still the house she believed it to be, or only the structure of one. She rose and went to the window. The kitchen garden was invisible in the dark below, but she knew it was there. The bay tree in its pot was on the sill, its leaves very dark and slightly glossy in the firelight, alive. Edmund came to stand behind her. She heard him. She did not turn. His hand came to rest at her shoulder, not pressing, not claiming, simply resting there with the specific weight of a man who is not sure he has the right, and is doing it anyway. She set the silver mirror on the sill beside the bay tree. He said, very quietly, "I am glad you came back." She said, "I know." She said, "Edmund." She said his name in the voice she used for the things that cost her considerably, and she felt his hand move from her shoulder to her jaw, as it had done in the entrance hall on her first night. And this time, he did not withdraw it. This is, for those who stayed, what it looks like when something survives not by luck, but by the specific accumulated weight of being worth surviving. If this story moved something in you, leave a word in the quiet below. We will begin again soon. Spring came early to Caldwick Hall that year, or perhaps Cecily simply noticed it more, having spent a winter in someone else's season. By February, the kitchen garden was showing the first green at the edge of the herb bed, the rosemary she had trimmed back in November, putting out small pale shoots along its new borders. She went to the garden every morning. Edmund joined her twice a week at first, and then more often, standing at the edge of the bed with his hands in his coat pockets while she worked, asking questions about the planting that he had no practical reason to ask, except that she was the one who answered them. She taught him which stems to leave and which to cut. And he listened with his full attention, which was a quality she had always valued in him, and had not, she realized, sufficiently acknowledged before. He had a particular way of listening to her that she had taken for granted in the first years of the marriage, when listening seemed like the least that could be asked, and had come to miss very specifically in the months when she had no one to listen to her at all. The garden was, she discovered, a useful place for a marriage conducting the quiet business of restoration. The work gave them something to look at other than each other, and the looking at each other happened anyway, sidelong, in the moments between one task and the next, in the way that important things tend to happen when a person has stopped bracing for them. Agatha came to call in March, alone, without preparation or announcement, and sat with Cecily in the morning room and drank her tea, and was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, at last, "I believed I was protecting the estate. I need you to know I also believed it was protection of a kind for Edmund. I was wrong about the second thing." Cecily looked at her mother-in-law's careful, composed face, and saw the effort the statement had cost, and said, "I know you were not without affection for me, Agatha." "No," Agatha said, "I was not." "Then we need not spend a great deal of time on the rest of it," Cecily said. Agatha looked at her for a long moment, and then she said, with something that was nearly warmth, "You are not what I imagined you were when Edmund brought you here." Cecily said, "You are not entirely what I imagined either." They finished their tea, and neither of them found it necessary to say anything more about the previous autumn, and the morning room fire burned steadily. And outside the window the drive was bare and pale in the March light, and the elms were beginning to consider coming into leaf. Mr. Hawthorne's letter arrived from London in the second week of March. The restoration of Lady Caldwick's legal standing was confirmed without complication. Mrs. Pelham brought it to the morning room with an expression of considerable personal satisfaction that she did not attempt to conceal, and Cecily read it once and then folded it and set it aside. She went to the kitchen garden. The bay tree had been repotted and moved outside when the weather softened, set against the south wall of the kitchen garden where it had always been before she brought it indoors for the winter. It stood in the mid-morning light, its leaves very green and very still in the windless air, exactly as it had stood in the springs before. Edmund came to the garden gate. He stopped there with his hand on the latch and watched her standing by the bay tree. She did not turn immediately. She ran her thumb along one of the leaves and felt the slight waxy resistance of it, and listened to the particular quiet of the enclosed garden, which was a quiet she had imagined very precisely during a great many cold months in rooms that were not her own. Then she turned. He was watching her with the expression she had begun to recognize over the past months, the one that was not quite anything it could be named, that lived in the line of his jaw and the steadiness of his eyes, that the world would call composure, and that she had come to understand was something rather more than that. She crossed the garden to the gate. He opened it. She stepped through, into the pale morning light, and he offered her his arm with the quiet deliberateness of a man making a choice he intends to keep making. And she took it, and they walked the length of the south wall together without speaking. And the bay tree stood in the garden behind them in the mild spring air, and the silver mirror was on the sill upstairs in the west bedroom, where she had placed it the morning after her rooms were restored, where it had stayed, where it would stay, where it caught the light at certain hours, and threw a small bright circle on the opposite wall that served no practical purpose whatsoever, and that she had no intention of moving. She had been in the sea. She had come home. The house had received her. That was enough. That was, in the end, everything.